A crowd sat impatiently waiting the launch of the largest ship this world had ever seen, watching as she sat on her launch rails. 3, 2, 1, launch. The ship stalled on the launch rails and screams erupted as numerous men were injured and killed, and the ship sat pathetically stuck on her launch ramp. The crowd looked at one another and they deemed her unlucky. Little did they know just how true that statement really was. Welcome to Shipwreck Sunday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for a younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. SS Great Eastern would be the love of her designer's life and also his last project. This designer being the legendary Isambard Kingdom Brunel. And after his success in pioneering steam travel to North America with Great Western and Great Britain, he turned his eye to a ship capable of making longer voyages as far as Australia. With a planned capacity of 15,000 tons of coal, Great Eastern was envisioned as being able to sail halfway around the world without taking on coal, while also carrying so much cargo and passengers that papers described her as a, quote, floating city, and the Crystal Palace of the sea. Brunel saw the ship as being able to effectively monopolize trade with Asia and Australia, making regular trips between Britain and either Trincomalee or Australia. On March 25, 1852, Brunel sketched out a steamship in his diary and wrote underneath it, quote, say 600 feet by 65 feet by 30 feet. These measurements were 6 times larger by volume than any ship afloat. Such a large ship would benefit from economies of scale and would be both fast and economical, requiring fewer crew than the equivalent tonnage made up of smaller ships. Brunel realized that a ship of this size would need more than one propulsion system, since twin screws were still in the experimental phase, so he settled upon a combination of a single screw and paddle wheels, with auxiliary sail power as a backup, which was common for this era. Although Brunel had pioneered the screw propeller on a large scale with Great Britain, he did not believe that it was possible to build a single propeller and shaft or a paddle shaft that could transmit the required power to drive this massive ship at the needed speed. Brunel showed his sketches to John Scott Russell, an experienced naval architect and a shipbuilder whom he had first met at the Great Exhibition in 1851. Scott Russell examined Brunel's plan and made his own calculations as to the ship's feasibility. He calculated that it would be a displacement of 20,000 tons and would require 8,500 horsepower to achieve 14 knots, but he did think it was indeed possible. At Scott Russell's suggestion, they approached the directors of the Eastern Steam Navigation Company with the new, revolutionary design plan. The James Wyatt Company would design the ship's screw, Professor Piazza Smythe would design its gyroscopic equipment, and Russell himself would build the hull and paddle wheel. It was indeed a group project on a massive scale. Brunel and John Scott Russell would enter an official partnership at this point. Unknown to Brunel, however, Russell was in a financial rut. The two men disagreed on many details, as it was Brunel's final great project and he actually collapsed from a stroke after being photographed on Great Eastern's deck, dying just 10 days later, a mere 4 days after her first sea trials. About the ship, Brunel was quoted as saying, quote, I have never embarked on any one thing to which I have so entirely devoted myself, and to which I have devoted so much time, thought, and labor, on the success of which I have staked so much reputation. The Great Babe, as he lovingly called her, was really everything to him, and it's a shame he didn't see her completion. Great Eastern, which had been ordered in 1853 for Eastern Steam Navigation Company, was built by Messrs. Scott Russell and Company of Millwall, Middlesex, England. Her keel was laid down on May 1, 1854. This behemoth ocean liner displaced 32,160 tons fully loaded, and her tonnages sat at 18,915 gross register tons and 13,344 net register tons. She was 692 feet long, had a beam of 82 feet wide, a draft of 20 feet deep unloaded, and a draft of 29 feet 10 inches deep fully laden. She spanned 4 decks, with a capacity of 4,000 passengers and 418 for her crew complement. She was equipped with 18 lifeboats until after 1860, when she'd get 2 more, bringing her total lifeboats up to 20. When we look at her hull, it was an all-iron construction, as was the norm at the time. A double hull of 3/4 of an inch wrought iron in 2 feet 10-inch plates with ribs every 5 feet 11 inches. Her roughly 30,000 iron plates weighed a third of a long ton each and were cut over individually made wooden templates before being rolled to the required curvature. Internally, the hull was divided by two 351-foot 1-inch long, 59-foot 1-inch high longitudinal bulkheads and further transverse bulkheads dividing the ship into 19 compartments. Great Eastern was the first ship to incorporate a double-skinned hull, a feature which would not be seen again in a ship for 100 years, but which would later become compulsory for reasons of safety. To maximize fuel capacity, stored coal was bunkered around and over her 10 rectangular boilers, which provided steam at 25 psi. She had sail, paddle, and screw propulsion as we mentioned earlier. Her paddle wheels were 55 feet 9 inches in diameter, and the 4-bladed screw propeller was 23 feet 11 inches across. The power came from 4 steam engines for the paddles and an additional engine for the propeller. Total power was estimated at 8,000 horsepower. She had 6 masts, said to be named after the days of the week, beginning with Monday as the foremast and Saturday as the spanker mast, rigged similar to a topsail schooner with a main gaff sail on each one, 1 jib on the foremast, and 3 square sails on masts Tuesday and Wednesday. Setting sails turned out to actually be unusable at the same time as when the paddles and screw were under steam, because the hot exhaust from the 5, later reduced to 4, funnels would set them on fire. Her maximum speed was 13 knots. She was involved in numerous accidents during her construction, with 6 workers being killed. Originally, she was christened Leviathan because of her gargantuan size. However, her high building and launching costs absolutely wrecked the Eastern Steam Navigation Company, and so she lay unfinished for a year before being sold to the Great Eastern Ship Company and finally renamed Great Eastern. She was launched on January 31, 1858, then being completed in August of 1859 after her sea trials. She already was facing adversity, and it would only continue. If you're enjoying this video, leave me a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and let me know down in the comment section below. Okay, let's get into her career. Originally, Great Eastern was planned to be launched on November 3, 1857. However, her massive size posed major logistical issues. According to one source, the ship's 19,000 tons or 12,000 inert tons during the launch made it the single heaviest object moved by humans to that point. On November 3rd, a large crowd gathered to watch the ship launch, including notable present including the Comte de Paris, the Duke Aumale, and the Siamese ambassador to Britain, some of the hoitiest and toitiest of society. The launch, however, failed, and the ship was left stranded on its launch rails. In addition, 2 men were killed and several others injured, leading some to declare the Great Eastern an unlucky ship. Brunel rescheduled the launch for January of 1858, hoping to use the tide in the next launch attempt. In the lead-up to the second launch, Brunel and Great Eastern's backers gathered a significant number of chains, jacks, hydraulic rams, and windlasses to assist in the ship's launch. Some were obtained through sympathetic engineers, and others through returned favors, and yet more for increasing sums of money. It was so expensive renting out supplies for the ship's launch that engineer Richard Tang was able to found his own engineering firm the next year with the cash he accrued from renting out equipment. He remarked, quote, "We launched Great Eastern, and she launched us." Advice sent to Brunel on how to launch the ship came from a number of sources, including steamboat captains on the Great Lakes, and one admirer who wrote an insightful description on how the massive bronze horseman had been erected in St. Petersburg. High winds prevented the ship from being launched on January 30th, but the next morning a fresh attempt successfully launched the ship at 10 a.m. After her launch, Great Eastern spent the next 8 months fitting out. The cost of the fitting out, which was $600,000 at the time, was a concern to numerous investors, who'd already spent nearly $6 million constructing her. With the building company already in debt, cost-cutting measures were implemented. The ship was removed from Russell's shipyard, and many investors requested she be sold. As reported by The Times, one investor openly proposed that the ship should be sold to the Royal Navy, noting if the Navy employed Great Eastern as a ram, she could easily cleave through any warship afloat. As we know, ocean liners in general make poor warships, so a ram, hospital ship, or troop transport might be the only useful uses for her militarily. These efforts had mixed success, with the ship eventually being sold to a new company for £800,000, equating to a loss of $3 million for investors in the Eastern Steam Navigation Company. The new company modified parts of its predecessor's design, most notably cutting the ship's coal capacity as it intended to use the ship for the American market. Fitting out was finished in August of 1859 and was marked with a lavish banquet for visitors. Either August 31st, 1859, or sometime early in September of 1859, she set off from her dock toward the channel, accompanied by several spectators. However, off Hastings, she suffered a massive steam explosion caused by a valve being left shut by accident after a pressure test of the system that killed 5 crewmen and destroyed the forwardmost funnel. She headed to Portland Bill, and then to Holyhead, though some investors claimed more money could have been made if the ship had remained as an exhibition ship for tourists in the Thames. Great Eastern successfully rode out the infamous Royal Charter storm, after which she was moved to Southampton for the winter. The start of 1860 led to a further change of ownership when the owning company was found to be badly in debt and the value of the ship depreciated by half. This revelation forced the resignation of the board of directors, who were then replaced by a third group of controlling stockholders. So far, Great Eastern has been a beautiful money pit. My mom always told me that BOAT stood for bust out another 1,000, as we had a boat growing up and it cost more money than the trouble it was worth. So, Great Eastern is busting out another 1,000. With the new board in place, the ship was recapitalized to raise an additional $50,000. The new board was determined to finish her, but also bet heavily on making large profits exhibiting the ship in North American seaports. To accomplish this, the company played major American and Canadian cities against each other, goading them into a competition over which city would welcome Great Eastern. The city of Portland, Maine, along with additional investment from the Grand Trunk Railway, went so far as to build a $125,000 pier to accommodate her. Ultimately, New York City, which had quickly dredged a berth for her alongside a lumber wharf, was decided on as the ship's first destination. It's been a long time coming, but we finally have reached her maiden voyage. It lasted 11 days and began on June 17, 1860 from Liverpool with 35 paying passengers, 8 company deadheads or passengers who don't pay, and 418 crew. Among the passengers were 2 journalists, Zara Colburn and Alexander Lyman Hawley. Her first crossing went without incident, and the ship's seaworthiness was proven again when she easily survived a small gale. Great Eastern arrived in New York City on June 28th and successfully docked, though she did damage part of a wharf. The ship was received with great self-confidence, with many vessels and tens of thousands of people crowding to see her. In preparation for the crowds, the crew established a bar on deck, spread sand to soak up tobacco juice, and prepared to receive thousands of visitors. However, relations between the crew and New Yorkers quickly soured. The public was outraged by the $1 entry fee, since similar excursion trips only cost 25 cents. Due to this, many visitors decided to forego visiting the ship. Great Eastern left New York late in July, taking several hundred passengers on an excursion trip to Cape May and then to Old Point, Virginia. However, this too raised issues as the ship didn't have enough provisions due to a burst pipe in a storeroom that ruined much of the ship's food. This made the short trip uncomfortable, while the ship's rudimentary bathrooms posed a sanitation issue. Duplicate tickets were sold for some berths, families were separated and remixed in improperly assigned cabins, and 5 plainclothes officers were discovered and chased into a livestock pen on deck. After reaching Virginia, the ship headed back to New York, and from there sailed south again for an excursion cruise in Chesapeake Bay. The ship departed for Annapolis, where it was given 5,000 tons of coal by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Great Eastern remained in Annapolis for several days, where she was toured by several thousand visitors and President James Buchanan. During the presidential visit, one member of the company board discussed sending the ship to Savannah to transport southern cotton to English mills, but this idea was never followed up on. Upon her return to New York, the company decided to sail from the United States. From a financial perspective, the American venture was a disaster. She'd only taken in $120,000 against a $72,000 overhead, whereas the company expected to take in $700,000. In addition, the company was facing a daily interest payment of $5,000, which ate into any profits the ship made. They hoped to net more profit prior to returning to England, so the ship sailed in mid-August for Halifax with 100 passengers. However, on approach to the port, the ship was hailed by a local lighthouse service, which was empowered by law to collect a toll based on ship tonnage. Given she was so huge, the toll against Great Eastern was $1,750. Infuriated by the size of the toll, a party went ashore to request that it be waived entirely, but the governor of Halifax denied this request. Angered by the refusal, the captain and company leadership ordered the ship to return to England immediately, and as such, no passengers or visitors were taken on in Halifax. Financially, it was a disaster, but in an engineering sense, it was a great success, and so the company again attempted to turn Great Eastern profitable. During the winter of 1860, Scott Russell, who'd recently won $120,000 legal judgment against the company, refitted the ship and repaired damage sustained during its first year of operations. During this refit, she broke free of her moorings and cut off the bowsprit of HMS Blenheim. She departed for New York in May of 1861 since her other port of Baltimore, Maryland was now considered too dangerous due to the outbreak of the American Civil War. She arrived in port with little fanfare. Taking on a cargo of 5,000 tons of barreled wheat and 194 passengers, she departed for Liverpool on May 25th, making an uneventful trip. Upon returning to England, it was announced that the ship's company had been contracted by the British War Office to transport 2,000 troops to Canada, part of a show of force to intimidate the rapidly arming United States. After a further refit to carry troops, she departed Britain for Quebec City carrying 2,144 soldiers, 473 passengers, 122 horses, and her crew of 400. According to one source, this number of passengers and crew marked the most number of people aboard a single ship to that point in history. The voyage was a success, and the ship made it to Quebec, where it took 2 days for the city's steamers to ferry the passengers from the ship. The crossing was made in record-setting time, taking 8 days and 6 hours. Great Eastern's durable design was praised by the military officers aboard, but soon after her return to Britain, the War Office discontinued the contract, and the ship returned to regular passenger service. In September of 1861, the ship was caught in a major hurricane 2 days out of Liverpool. She was trapped in the storm for 3 days and suffered major damage to her propulsion systems. Both of her paddle wheels were torn off, her sails ripped away, and her rudder had been bent to 200 degrees and subsequently torn up by the ship's only propeller. A jerry-rigged propeller was installed, allowing the ship to steer for Ireland powered only by her screw. Arriving in Queenstown, she was denied entry to the harbor as it was feared high winds would cause her to smash her anchorage, only being allowed in 3 days later and towed in by HMS Advice, tearing the anchor off an American merchant on her way to her berth. The only death occurred in port when a man was killed by the backspin off the helm. Damage caused by the storm and lost revenue from the trip added up to $300,000. She continued in a cycle of uneventful cruises, cargo loadings, and brief exhibitions from late 1861 to mid-1862. By July of 1862, the ship was turning its first noteworthy profits, carrying 500 passengers and 8,000 tons of foodstuffs from New York to Liverpool, bringing in $225,000 in gross and requiring a turnaround of only 11 days. However, the ship's owners struggled to sustain this profitability as they were heavily focused on upper and middle-class passenger trade. As we know, ocean liners' bread and butter is the third-class immigrant trade, and Great Eastern's owners were not taking advantage of this, even though there was a major downturn in the American clipper industry during the American Civil War, and it would have been a perfect time to capitalize on this. On August 17, 1862, Great Eastern departed from Liverpool for New York City, carrying 820 passengers and several thousand tons of cargo. After outrunning a small squall, the ship approached the New York coast on the night of August 27th. Fearing that Great Eastern was resting too low in the water to pass by Sandy Hook, the ship's captain instead chose the nominally safer route through Long Island Sound. While passing Montauk Point around 2 a.m., the ship collided with an uncharted rock needle, later called Great Eastern Rock ironically enough, that stood about 26 feet below the surface. The rock punctured the outer hull of the ship, leaving a gash 9 feet wide and 83 feet long. The collision was noticed by the crew, who guessed that the ship had struck a shifting sand shoal, and after a bilge check, the Great Eastern continued on to New York without further incident. While in port, however, she was listing to starboard slightly, and so a diver was sent in to check out the damage. After several days, the hole was discovered, and it was an issue since no dry dock in the world could help Great Eastern thanks to her gargantuan size. She was repaired by metal workers in cofferdom, but cost the company $350,000 and delayed the ship's return to Britain by several months. She would make one more trip to New York and back in 1863 before being laid up until 1864 due to operating costs. In January of 1864, it was announced the ship would be auctioned off. During the auction, 4 members of the company board of directors bid $125,000 for the ship and won her, thus acquiring personal control of the ship. The group then allowed the ship company to go bankrupt, thus separating the ship from the now defunct shipping company and divesting many smaller stockholders. The ship was then contracted out to Cyrus West Field, an American financier who intended to use her to lay underwater telegraph cables. The ship's owners developed a business model whereby they would rent out Great Eastern as a cable layer in exchange for shares in cable companies, ensuring that if Great Eastern succeeded in laying cables, the unprofitable ship could be personally lucrative for her owners. Finally, a bright spot looked like it was on the horizon. But how long would it last? Thank you so much to our amazing YouTube members and patrons. If you'd like to have some awesome perks like episodes a full day in advance, join our YouTube memberships today. Okay, let's get into the cable laying and the end of Great Eastern's career. In May of 1865, Great Eastern headed to Sheerness to take on wire for the laying of the second transatlantic telegraph cable. In return for using the ship, her owners wanted $250,000 in telegraph company stock, but only on the condition the wire laying succeeded. To accommodate the 13,950 miles of cable she was carrying, she had some of her salons and rooms replaced with large tanks to hold the cable. In July, she began laying the undersea cable near Valentia Island, gradually working her way west at a speed of 6 knots. The effort went relatively smoothly for several weeks, but disaster would strike when the cables snapped, and the end was lost mid-Atlantic in an accident, forcing the ship to return later in 1866 with a new line. The ship's first officer, Robert Halpin, managed to locate the lost cable end, and the broken cable made it to shore in Heart's Content, Newfoundland on July 27, 1866. This meant that the ship successfully laid 2 transatlantic telegraph cables. Halpin became the ship's captain, with the ship laying more cables. In early 1869, she laid a series of undersea cables near Brest. Later that year, she was outfitted to lay undersea cables in the Indian Ocean, with most of the operation's expenses being covered by the British government and banks in India, which hoped to circumvent the unreliable overland cables linking Britain and India. In preparation for operations in the hot climate, the ship was painted white to deflect heat away from the ship's cable tanks. Great Eastern left Britain in December of 1869, arriving in Bombay 83 days later to lay her first cable anchor. Upon arriving in port, Great Eastern's size generated considerable public interest, with the captain offering tickets to view the ship for 2 rupees apiece, distributing proceeds to the crew. Departing from Bombay before the onset of the monsoon season, she proceeded north to lay a cable between Bombay and Aden. From Aden, she laid another cable to the island of Jebel al-Tair, where a second ship rendezvoused with her to take up the cable to Suez and then on to Alexandria. However, the Suez Canal, which had opened in 1869, was a setback for the ship, as at the time the channel was too shallow for the massive ship. Going around Africa, it would not be able to compete with ships that could use the canal. Ali Rushdie, a famed Arab navigator, proposed taking her through the canal anyway, but this was never attempted. At the end of her cable-laying career, which was hastened by the launch of C.S. Faraday, a ship purpose-built for cable-laying, she was refitted as a liner, but once again, efforts to make her a commercial success failed. She remained moored in the Milford Harbor for some time, annoying the Milford Harbor Board, which wanted to build dockyards in the area. Many proposals for the ship were raised, like filling her with gunpowder and blowing her sky high. The ship was ultimately saved, as Frederick Appleby, a dock engineer, was able to build a dock around her, using the ship's massive hulk as a station for driving pylons. During her 11 years moored here, she accrued a large amount of biofouling on her hull. She was sold at auction at Lloyd's on November 4, 1885, by order of the Court of Chancery. Bidding commenced at £10,000, rising to £26,200 and sold to Mr. Mattis, a city merchant. Sold once more, she was used as a showboat, a floating concert house, and gymnasium. She later acted as an advertising hoarding, essentially a giant billboard, sailing up and down the Mersey for Lewis's department store, who at this point were her owners, before being sold yet again. The idea was to attract people to the store by using her as a floating visitor attraction. In 1886, she sailed to Liverpool for the Liverpool Exhibition of 1886. During the transit, she struck and badly damaged one of her tugs, the last of 10 total ships she would damage or sink. On May 10, 1887, the steamship G.E. Wood crashed into her in the Mersey. Sold once more after the expedition, one company considered using her to raise shallow shipwrecks, while one humorist suggested that Great Eastern be used to help dig the Panama Canal by ramming her into the isthmus. She was again sold at auction in 1888, fetching £16,000 for her value as scrap. Many pieces of the ship were bought by private collectors, former passengers, and friends of the crew, like fixtures, lamps, furniture, paneling, and other artifacts, some of which still exist. Parts of her were kept for repurposing. One ferry company converted her wood paneling into a public house bar, while one mistress at a Lancashire boarding school acquired the ship's deck caboose for use as a children's playhouse. She was an early example of breaking up a structure using a wrecking ball, and she was scrapped near the Sloyne at New Ferry on the River Mersey by Henry Bath & Son Limited from 1889 to 1890. It took 18 months to fully dismantle her, with her double hull being particularly difficult to salvage. The breaking of the ship caused a minor labor dispute as workers, who were paid by the ton of ship scrapped, became frustrated with the slow pace of breaking and went on strike. After Great Eastern's scrapping, rumors spread that the shipbreakers had found the remains of trapped workers entombed in her double hull, likely inspired by tales spread by her crew of a phantom riveter who had been allegedly sealed in the ship's hull. This has never been proven or disproven, leaving many questions remaining. Many argue it was impossible, especially given the extensive records of repairs on the ship and there being no skeletal remains discovered during these repairs. But it is a spooky story to digest nonetheless. The Great Eastern had so much potential, but the time was just not right for this ambitious beauty. She'd find some success as a cable layer and end her career as an embarrassing billboard, leaving behind a legacy of failure and tragedy. She will always be the great babe to me, despite her failures. The Japanese battleship sat at harbor after having been in training for a long while. Without warning, an explosion rang out into the air, and smoke and flames bloomed from the battleship. Immediately she listed, quickly sinking in the harbor and tragically cutting her career short. In next week's episode of Shipwreck Sunday, we get into the story of the battleship Mutsu.